Hi, I'm Shannan Palma. I'm an assistant professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies and founding faculty director of the graduate program in writing and digital communication at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta. My research explores how and why people get invested in stories, symbols, and ideas that are not in our own best interests. And you can find me on Twitter at Shannan Palma.
Hey y'all, I am Wanda Swan, and I am founder and executive director of the Swan Center for Advocacy and Research, which is a Georgia-based 501c3 that supports Black survivors of violence. I'm also an anti-oppression coach and content expert, and I work with executive leaders, mostly white executive leadership, and organizations interested in interrogating the ways anti-Blackness impacts their personal and professional relationships with other people and spaces. This is based on my research that seeks to receipt the origin story of the anti-violence movement, specifically centering the Black founders of the movement that have been all but whitewashed and eroded, and also unraveling the driving force of the components and strategies of this movement before it was co-opted by whiteness. You can find me on Instagram at Lawanda D Swan and at Swan underscore center underscore advocacy. And if you just want to see me on Twitter, I can be found at petty underscore truth. We're the hosts and co creators of Once Upon a Patriarchy, an internet show dedicated to unraveling oppression and gender based violence that is present within the structure of the Disney formula, with the particular or initial interest in Disney fairy tales. So each episode, we welcome a guest, provide a historical overview of the animated film being centered, and critique Disney's interpretation of a classic tale, with special attention being paid to how their iteration also aligns with white supremacist ideologies that often prove harmful to marginalized folks. We then invite our guests to retell this story with the perspective of their own identity specific expertise to fill gaps created by this problematic formula. And so our plan today is to deliver a banter that's quite similar to the style we present to audiences in our podcast episodes as a nod to the art form of oral storytelling. We invite you to jot down your thoughts during our brief overviews. We'd be happy to answer any questions that may arise.
So first off, I am going to situate our work, which started with digging into Disney's fairy tale films within a broader history of folklore and oral storytelling. So Marina Warner, big deal, cultural historian who wrote From the Beast to the Blonde on fairy tales and their tellers, one of the most influential books in fairy tale studies. She traces the lineage of these tales back through a long tradition of female storytellers. Warner approaches the so-called wonder tales in a broad sense, and she very persuasively situates the figure of Mother Goose, you remember her from nursery rhymes, as the product of a storytelling tradition that's traced back through medieval gossips, back through the Queen of Sheba to the mythological Sibyl. So basically, fairy tales are women's tales. Now, according to Warner, within the female storytelling tradition, the prime distinction between fairy tales and the oft ridiculed old wives' tale is the emergence of the fairy tale as a literary genre that's dominated by male writers and collectors. Now, there are women writers too, but the point is that fairy tales gain marginal respectability when men take an interest and start writing them down. Still, she notes that in Europe, during the time period ranging from the late 16th century into the early 18th, fairy tales were pedagogical or teaching stories that alternately upheld the morality or critiqued the injustices of society from or for the female perspective. Now, here I would add the marker, the white Western female perspective. The friction between fairy tale retellings that conserve the status quo and those that disrupt it lies in their pedagogical power. The storyteller's agenda, the messages that they wanted to convey about life, that shapes their retelling. In the present day US, fairy tales remain important pedagogical stories. So the influence of the Disney Corporation on contemporary childhood has ensured that stories of wicked fairies, oppressed princesses, monstrous bodies, and skin as white as snow are as or more familiar to Westerners today as they would have been to children hundreds of years ago.
And I think that foundation itself calls for much critique. As Shannan unpacks these components of Disney's influence, it quickly becomes clear to me, as a Black, brown skinned, fat bodied woman, that my being, um, relegated to a storyline, my being specifically presents as inequitable and unattainable to that of a princess, right? Additionally, it calls for me to interrogate the ways that we're taught to hold and value the oppressed experiences of the fair skinned princesses, as opposed to those who have been othered. And I use other to be inclusive of both sides and ability. And we have some insight into that as we take a more longitudinal view of how Disney villains and outcasts are presented on screen and film. So Disney has a nasty habit of othering many of their villains by darkening their skin. Both Ursula and Maleficent are proof of this. They're also quick, or they make quick work of fat body characters, right? By either using them as props to amplify the beauty of the princess figure or further compounding their villain state, as they did with Ursula. Quasimodo is another character that is othered and demonized for possessing a body deemed monstrous. And there are so many other examples, Shannon.
Oh, yes, there are, Wanda. And our point is that the Disneyfication of fairy tales and their categories of who is worthy of a happy ending and who isn't, that matters. Fairy tales function as contemporary American myths, and for that claim, I build on the work of my fellow fairy tale scholars, Christina Bakalega, Gina Jorgensen, Jack Zipes, and many others. Fairy tales are assumed to be known. They're assumed to be worthy to be known, and thus they can be co-opted and retold to serve all kinds of ideological ends. As Wanda pointed out, Disney's retellings narrativize and reinforce these heavily racialized taxonomies of which manifestations of womanhood are desirable and which are worthy of aversion or punishment. Roland Barthes argues that myth is fundamentally a tool of the right. But Bruce Lincoln, who's a mythologist more in line with our thinking, has very convincingly argued that myths can be tools of revolution when they're reinterpreted or retold to alter the sentiments of affinity and estrangement that they evoke. Basically, myths tell us who's a part of our gang and who's not. So when we retell them in ways that change those lines, we foment changes in society. Myths need to be imbued with explicit meaning before the social taxonomies they reinforce can be fully dismantled. In this sense, much feminist and anti-racist criticism is an exercise in what I call critical mythography. So when Wanda and I started Once Upon a Patriarchy, we wanted to explore and disrupt the meanings and taxonomies embedded in Disney's fairy tale myths, building on my work as a mythologist, her work as an anti-oppression theorist and activist, and a strong mutual belief in oral storytelling as a tool of resistance. So now I've put the fairy tale piece in context, why we chose Disney. Wanda is going to say a little bit more about how this work functions in relation to anti-oppressive advocacy and oral storytelling in that context.
Right. I feel like a solid starting place to begin is with an overview of what we mean by anti oppressive advocacy and later how it aligns with the activism of oral storytelling. So, anti oppressive advocacy is a framework that refers to the responsibility of those social change indoctrinated in America.
Oh, Wanda, you're breaking up.
Let's see here.
Got it?
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Excellent.
Okay. I'm going to take my headset off.
Anti-oppressive
All right.
advocacy framework. That's what I heard.
Boom. Boom. Thank you.
Mm.
So it is a framework I created that refers to the responsibility of those agents of social change indoctrinated in American culture to prioritize the unraveling of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Its purpose is to create a conscious break from what I've defined as white comfort, a tool of race-based oppression that sustains ideologies that often embolden the myth of white superiority. This framework was originally created to support anti-violence professionals in the work of critiquing the historic gaps in the field that often occur at the intersection of bias and service provision for marginalized survivors of violence. It's a framework that has since been proven to aid various industries in confronting the dangers of defaulting to a white race and culture within well-established multicultural environments. And one of those dangers involves the erasure of expertise and lived experiences of those folks, they're my hellhounds, y'all, I apologize, who exist outside of this default. This piece is what ties together this framework for our podcast. The connection and power that exists when one story is told by them in their own words and is reflective of their lived experiences does the work of demystifying the idea of whiteness as expert in all things and allows those with proximity to whiteness to be relegated to student or learner.
This idea that whiteness does not entail expertise in everything is really key, right? So part of the impetus for the podcast came when Wanda and I were discussing our memories of Disney's Little Mermaid. She retold the story, reading characters and relationships in ways that never would have occurred to me. And for all that I have studied fairy tales and retellings for, at the time, I think it was 13 years, her retelling taught me things about what I saw, but more importantly, what I didn't see in the tale and in Disney's film. Her retelling, the way that she redrew those lines of affinity and estrangement that Lincoln talked about, it exposed gaps in fairy tale studies as a field, right? Which tends to function in that space of default whiteness. So her ephemeral act of oral storytelling, and we were just walking our dogs, our hellhounds, through the dog park at the time, forever altered the resonance of the myth for me and generated this intervention in the study of the fairy tale.
Thank you. I muted myself because my hellhounds are still excited in the background. I apologize. So I'll continue and say that I think people are quite familiar with the Disney formula for making magic, right? It usually includes a fair prince here, a fair princess there, some magical animals scattered about, an outcast villain seeking revenge, a male in power whose performance of masculinity is both feared and applauded. A village of forgettable people who are easily riled up against a villain they've never taken the time to know more about. A damsel in distress, the killing or incarceration of the outcast, a wedding and animals being in the wedding party, and a happily ever after, right? That's the general consensus. This formula not only leans into all the problematic components we referenced earlier, but it constantly sets up this merit-based look at how one can be complicit in the perpetuation of oppression and counteract the work that Disney has done to send messages, well, can be complicit and still live happily ever after. So what the podcast allows us to do is to confront and counteract the work that Disney has done and to send messages that sustain white comfort. And so we interrogate that, right? And so in that way, oral storytelling and the way that we present it is a disruption in and of itself. It disrupts the norm that whiteness sponsors and feeds us. It creates an opportunity for marginalized voices to just be, to exist on an equitable and level playing field. What anti-Blackness and white supremacy does is it gets us all comfortable with this global agreement to devalue certain people. And that devaluing is what makes violence negotiable and or acceptable. We, instead of normalizing narratives that create distance between people, we use oral storytelling to close the gaps, to value humanity, to provide space for the varied lived experiences of those who come on our show to coexist. And so we invite people to tell their version of the story, and we tell our own. There is no original or only, and that's the freedom and resistance that oral storytelling allows.
So I think we have still a couple of minutes, and in that spirit, Wanda, we were talking over the break about Eichelberger's work. We got 2 minutes, which came up in the first panel, and you had a really different perspective on Anglogynophobia. And could you share that story?
Sure. In the last few minutes that we have here, I think it's interesting to bring up Eichelberger today in this work. And that work is also something that I've also studied, especially looking at the 5 categories of reasons that she felt led to Black women's rejection of white feminism. And one that is often critiqued by anti-oppression coaches and honestly, specifically Black women, Black feminist women, of today is this idea of Black women's naivete of the women's movement. And I think that's the piece specifically that sits in disarray with the understanding and the history of of the research that I'm doing. Specifically, the research that I've spent the last 7 years looks at how Black women built movements, right? And how what whiteness as a construct does is that it erases the traces of these women. And so I think the nuances of Eichelberger's philosophy aren't critiqued hard enough. And I think what also isn't critiqued is the weight of the labor that Black women actually have to hold in order to do this work. And so I don't think that this is a phobia or this is a hostility. I think Black women are exhausted. I think Black feminists are exhausted. And I think that it is not simply a space where Black women or Black feminists are not wanting to don't understand what is happening with the movement. Is that we do not possess the privilege to choose and pick and choose which oppression we need to prioritize. And so I think that that is clear more so than what's going on right now, because if Black women didn't understand or didn't have or express naivete at the movement, there's no way Georgia could have flipped blue today. There's no way that a lot of the states that we are looking, these swing states, and the fate of this country as a voting democracy sat squarely in the hands and the labor of the work of Black feminists who well understood, but who are not interested in picking and choosing for some.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for having us here today, Beth and Agatha. We're really excited about the Q&A.